It is April 19th, 1943. A Japanese recovery team moves through dense jungle on the island of Bougainville, pushing through undergrowth near the village of Bouin. They find wreckage first, the broken aluminum skeleton of a Mitsubishi bomber scattered through the trees. Then, 30 meters from the fuselage, they find 2 seats thrown clear of the impact. In one of them, still upright, still strapped in, still gripping his officer's sword, is Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Fleet Admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the most decorated officer in the history of the Japanese fleet. He has been dead since yesterday morning, shot through the head at 9:34 a.m. by an American fighter plane over the jungle he is still sitting in. The men who killed him flew 600 miles across the Pacific Ocean to find him, because they knew exactly where he would be and exactly when he would arrive, because American code breakers had read his travel itinerary the week before. The previous afternoon, as the American fighters turned back toward home, one pilot broke radio silence to broadcast a single sentence. "That son of a bitch will not be dictating any peace terms in the White House." He wasn't. Yamamoto wrote that line about marching into Washington, signing peace terms in the White House in January 1941, nearly a year before Pearl Harbor. He wrote it as a warning, as evidence that Japan could not win, as an argument against starting the war at all. Japanese propaganda stripped off the final lines, the part where he asked whether Japan's leaders had truly counted the cost, and published the first part as a boast. And so the man who had spent years begging Japan not to fight America died in an American ambush, being celebrated as the man who had planned to conquer it. This is a story about the cost of being right when the people in power refuse to listen, and then being ordered to prove it. He was born on April 4th, 1884, in Nagaoka, a former samurai stronghold in Niigata Prefecture on Japan's northwestern coast, a domain that had backed the wrong side in the Meiji Restoration and paid for it with defeat and shame. He came from a family that understood honorable loss. His father was a poor school teacher. He was the 7th son, and his father named him Isoroku, the Japanese word for 56, because that was his age when the boy arrived. He tested for the Naval Academy at 17, finished 2nd out of 300. He graduated in 1904, in time to serve aboard the cruiser Nishin at the Battle of Tsushima, the great engagement of the Russo-Japanese War, in which the Japanese Navy obliterated the Russian Baltic Fleet in a single afternoon. Tsushima marked him permanently, more literally than most. An explosion in the Nishin's forward turret cost him the index and middle fingers of his left hand. He was 21. Those missing fingers would remain visible for the rest of his life. The physical remnant of Japan's last great naval victory carried on the body of the man who would plan its next one. He rose with deliberate patience through the naval ranks. At Kasumigawara, commanding the Naval Air Station, he became Japan's most forceful advocate for a weapon his contemporaries still regarded with suspicion, the aircraft carrier. He pressed for faster planes, longer-range planes, carrier-borne fighters that could dominate the sky above a fleet. He trained his pilots in night flying when no one else thought to. He argued with admirals who clung to battleships, massive, armored, expensive. Battleships, he said, were like elaborate religious scrolls which old people hang in their homes. A matter of faith, not reality. But it was America that sharpened the edge of everything he knew. In 1919, he was sent to Harvard University to study economics. He stayed 2 years. Then Washington, as a naval attaché, for 2 more. He traveled through Texas and studied its oil fields. He walked through the auto factories in Detroit. He played poker in Washington saloons and became, by all accounts, quite good at it. He returned to Japan carrying American industrial power not as a statistic or a diplomatic cable, but as a physical fact he had moved through with his own body. He said it plainly afterward, Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America. Not a strategic calculation, testimony. He had been there. By 1941, he was Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet, the most venerated naval officer in Japan. Compact, powerfully built, with a broad face and the contained authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice. Beneath the uniform, a gambler. He loved shogi, go, cards, billiards. Colleagues said this quality ran directly into his strategic thinking, the ability to calculate odds, to read the table, to know when the bet was too expensive and when the pot was worth everything. He understood risk with a precision most of his peers mistook for recklessness. In 1941, the odds were not good. He had opposed the Tripartite Pact. The September 1940 alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy that, in Yamamoto's view, made conflict with America nearly inevitable. He argued against it loudly, by the standards of a culture that did not reward loud argument from naval officers. He lost. The Imperial Army was more politically powerful, and the army wanted the pact. The losing did not quiet him. As nationalist extremists murdered those who counseled restraint in the late 1930s, Yamamoto kept saying what he knew. A plot to kill him was uncovered in 1939. His superiors arranged a solution. They promoted him to admiral and sent him to sea as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, protective custody, dressed as an honor. He stayed on his flagship. He kept writing letters. In January 1941, he wrote to Ryoichi Sasakawa, a Diet member who spoke enthusiastically about war with America. The letter was direct to the point of insubordination. He explained that if Japan went to war with the United States, it would not be enough to take Guam, the Philippines, or even Hawaii. Japan would have to march into Washington and sign the peace terms in the White House. And then he asked, with quiet acidity, whether Japan's politicians, who spoke so lightly of such a war, had genuinely prepared for that, whether they had counted the cost. The final lines, the counsel of caution, the actual point, were stripped. Japanese propaganda published the first part. American propaganda amplified it. A private warning became a public boast. An admiral arguing for sanity became, in newspapers on both sides of the Pacific, the face of Japanese aggression. He did not stop. In 1940, he spoke to a group of school children, the most powerful naval officer in Japan, telling children what no one in power would say aloud. Japan cannot beat America, therefore Japan should not fight America. In September 1941, weeks before the final war decision, he gathered with old classmates from Nagaoka in Tokyo, men he had known since boyhood. He told them what he had told politicians, what he had told nationalists, what he had told children. It is a mistake to regard Americans as luxury-loving and weak. They are full of spirit, adventure, fight, and justice. Their thinking is scientific and well-advanced. American industry is far more developed than ours, and unlike Japan, they have all the oil they want. Japan cannot vanquish the United States. Therefore, we should not fight the United States. He had said some version of this for years. He said it there, among old friends, in what would be one of the last moments before the door closed. The door closed. An imperial conference confirmed the decision. Yamamoto, asked what he would do, said, "To fight the United States is like fighting the whole world, but it has been decided, so I will fight the best I can." Submission. The kind that costs everything. He did not merely accept the war, he designed its opening move, with the precision of a man who understood that if this gamble failed, nothing else would matter. The idea had come partly from watching the British. In November 1940, Royal Navy aircraft from the carrier HMS Illustrious attacked the Italian fleet at Taranto. striking battleships in a shallow harbor, at night with aerial torpedoes. 20 planes. Multiple sinkings. If the British could do it in the Mediterranean, Yamamoto believed the Japanese could do it in Hawaii. The problem was the harbor. Pearl Harbor averaged 40 feet of depth. Standard aerial torpedoes dove 75 feet on entry before leveling out. Drop them there, and they buried themselves in the mud before reaching anything worth hitting. Through the summer of 1941, Japanese engineers developed a modified torpedo, adjusted fins, recalibrated release parameters, capable of running shallow. The problem was solved. Yamamoto assembled a strike force around 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in support. His own staff gave the plan less than a 40% chance of success. He took the bet. Not because he believed it would win the war, but because it was the only move that gave Japan any chance of striking a blow severe enough to buy time for a negotiated peace before American industry fully mobilized. He was purchasing time he did not believe Japan had. The force would be commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a man who had opposed the plan from the start. Nagumo believed the carriers were too vulnerable, the risks disproportionate. He was overruled. He would command the attack anyway. And inside the architecture of the plan itself sits the deepest irony of Yamamoto's career. He was Japan's foremost advocate of carrier aviation. He had spent his professional life arguing that battleships were obsolete, that carriers and aircraft would decide the next naval war. He designed his Pearl Harbor strike to prioritize battleships. He prioritized them so heavily that he even considered abandoning the entire operation when the shallow water torpedo problem seemed unsolvable, because the torpedoes were needed for the armored battleships. Dive bombers required no such modification and would have been sufficient to destroy the lightly armored carriers. He kept the plan for the battleships. He kept the torpedoes. His own doctrine told him what was coming. He had argued it for years. He went to war against it anyway. The fleet departed Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November the 26th, heading east into a gray November Pacific. It is December 7th, 1941, a Sunday. The sky over Oahu is blue, lightly clouded, warm. The fleet lies at anchor in peacetime routine. Most crews are sleeping in or attending morning services. Radar operators at Opana Point detect the incoming Japanese formation at 7:02 a.m. The duty officer decides it must be American B-17S, expected from the mainland. At 7:48, the first wave arrives. 183 aircraft, Aichi dive bombers, Nakajima torpedo planes, Mitsubishi Zeros. They descend on Battleship Row. The torpedoes run shallow, exactly as engineered. A second wave follows at 8:50. The Japanese withdraw before 9:30, leaving behind a harbor choked with smoke and wreckage and the dead. 8 battleships are damaged. 4 are sunk. The USS Arizona takes a bomb through her forward magazine and detonates. 1,177 men die aboard her in seconds. When it is over, 2,403 Americans are dead. More than 180 aircraft are destroyed. The surface fleet of the United States Pacific Fleet, by any conventional accounting, is shattered. The plan worked, but the silence after the second wave withdrew held a different accounting, not of what was destroyed, but of what was not. The carriers were not there. Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, all 3 at sea, delivering planes, returning to the mainland on maneuver. Yamamoto's strike force withdrew without knowing this. The oil storage depots were untouched. 4.5 million barrels of fuel, enough to sustain the Pacific Fleet for months, sitting in tanks above the harbor, unscratched. The repair yards were intact. The dry docks were intact. The submarine base was intact. The entire industrial infrastructure of American Pacific naval power was exactly as it had been on December 6th. And the battleships, the ones Yamamoto had staked everything on, the ones he called elaborate religious scrolls, matters of faith rather than reality, would have been functionally obsolete within 2 years, regardless. He had understood this better than anyone in Japan's navy. He had targeted the symbols of American power. The substance of it was untouched. On December 8th, President Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The chamber rose. The vote for war was 470 to 1. Yamamoto had told them, he had told them for years, America does not quit, America unites. Once fully provoked, it does not negotiate from a position of humiliation. The question was now being settled. He had said 6 to 12 months. In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, he would run wild and win victory upon victory. After that, no expectation of success. He had meant it as a warning. Now it was a timetable. The timetable was holding. The Philippines fell, Malaya fell, the Dutch East Indies fell, and with them the oil Japan had gone to war to secure. Japanese carriers struck deep into the Indian Ocean, damaged British installations, pushed Allied forces westward. Churchill recorded his reaction in terms that needed no dramatization. He had never, he wrote, received a more direct shock. Over a vast expanse of waters, Japan was supreme, and the Allies were everywhere, weak and naked. It was real. Japan was winning, and the clock was running. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers launched from the deck of the carrier USS Hornet under Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle struck Tokyo. They flew over the imperial capital and dropped bombs on Japanese soil. The real damage was minimal. The effect was not. The Japanese military, which had promised the emperor his homeland was safe, had been exposed. Every faction in the Japanese High Command united behind a single objective: destroy the remaining American carrier fleet before it could strike again, which led directly to Midway. Yamamoto designed the Midway operation as a trap. Send a massive force toward the Midway Islands, close enough to Pearl Harbor that the Americans could not ignore the threat. The U.S. carriers would sortie to defend them. Yamamoto's superior firepower would destroy them. What remained of American naval power in the Pacific would be finished. The plan had one flaw Yamamoto could not know about. The Americans had broken the Japanese naval code. Admiral Chester Nimitz had been reading Yamamoto's operational orders before the Japanese ships left port. He knew the plan. He knew the fleet composition. He placed his 3 available carrier decks, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged but still operational Yorktown, in position to ambush the ambush. Yamamoto's own intelligence was also wrong. He believed he had sunk 2 American carriers at the Battle of the Coral Sea. He had sunk 1. He deployed his fleet on that assumption. On June 4, 1942, American dive bombers found the Japanese 1st Mobile Force with its flight decks full of aircraft being rearmed. Fuel lines running, ordnance stacked, crews working. In 6 minutes of combat, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were mortally hit. Hiryu survived long enough to counterattack before American aircraft found her as well. By evening, all 4 of Japan's frontline fleet carriers were gone. Nagumo's carriers, the very force whose vulnerability he had warned about when he opposed the Pearl Harbor plan, they were gone. The Battle of Midway concluded exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor and to the week. He had said 6 to 12 months. The clock ran out precisely on schedule. He wrote to a subordinate afterward. The failure at Midway was mine. Not self-pity. Accountability. He understood exactly what had happened, and he claimed it. After Midway, Japan never won another major naval battle in the Pacific War. The carriers were gone. The experienced pilots were gone. The strategic initiative was gone. From June 1942 forward, every campaign Japan fought was a defensive territory already taken against an industrial power now fully mobilized. Building carriers in months, training pilots by the thousands, doing precisely what Yamamoto had always said it would do when properly roused. By April 1943, Yamamoto is headquartered at Rabaul on New Britain, planning a morale inspection tour of Japanese air bases in the Upper Solomon Islands. The Guadalcanal campaign has ended in Japanese evacuation. The Solomons are slipping. He is still the most respected officer in the Japanese fleet, and a man overseeing a war that has already ended in the only way he ever said it would. The inspection tour is scheduled for April 18th. The itinerary is precise. 2 Mitsubishi Betty bombers carrying Yamamoto and his staff, escorted by 6 Zero fighters, arriving at the airstrip on Bougainville at 9:35 in the morning. The schedule is filed, transmitted, distributed to the relevant commands. Yamamoto was famous for his punctuality. His staff built their days around it. His subordinates trusted it absolutely. It was the quality that made him exceptional as a commander. The precision, the reliability, the professionalism his men had relied on across 3 years of war. On April 14th, the American Naval Intelligence Program, codenamed Magic, intercepted and decrypted the orders. The message contained everything: the date, the time, the route, the aircraft type, the number of escorts. A travel itinerary. Read in Washington before the planes were even fueled. The intelligence moved from Admiral Nimitz to Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox to President Roosevelt. The president's response was brief: "Get Yamamoto." The planning passed to Major John Mitchell of the 339th Fighter Squadron, based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Henderson Field. On the island Japan lost, in the campaign Yamamoto could not save. Mitchell's fighters were P-38 Lightnings, twin-engine, long-range, armed with 4 machine guns and an autocannon in the nose. The mission required a 600-mile approach at wave height, 30 to 50 feet above the ocean, in total radio silence, navigating 5 separate legs by compass, airspeed, and time alone, to arrive at a specific point in the sky at a specific moment. Mitchell calculated the odds of merely locating the target at 1,000 to 1. He planned it anyway, with the same methodical precision that defined everything Yamamoto built. The P-38S took off at 7:15 on the morning of April 18th, 1943, Palm Sunday. They formed up and left Guadalcanal at 7:30. The approach was long and hot, 50 feet above the Pacific, engines droning, radio silence absolute. Some pilots counted sharks in the water below. At 9:34, after more than 2 hours of silence, a voice came over the radio. Quiet, almost subdued. Bogies. Exactly on time. To the minute. The professionalism that made Yamamoto exceptional placed him in the sky at the precise moment and location the Americans needed him to be. His virtues had become his vulnerability. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber peeled off toward the 2 Bettys and their escorts. The fight was brief. Yamamoto's bomber took fire and went down trailing flame into the jungle below. One American pilot, Lieutenant Raymond Hine, did not return. Most historians now credit Barber with making the kill. Lanphier's angle was wrong, his distance too great. Lanphier would claim the credit for decades. Some things about Yamamoto's story were distorted almost immediately, even the account of his death. As the P-38s turned back toward Henderson Field, Lanphier broke radio silence. "That son of a bitch will not be dictating any peace terms in the White House." He was mocking a warning he had mistaken for a boast. The man who tried to stop the war died being celebrated as its architect. The Japanese recovery team finds him on April 19th, still in his seat, still strapped upright, still gripping his officer's sword. The medical report is clinical. gunshot wound to the head. He was, at the moment of impact, exactly as he had always presented himself to the world. Composed, holding his position, his left hand, missing the index and middle fingers since Tsushima, 1905, taken in the battle that made Japan a naval power, was on the hilt. Japan learns the truth slowly. The official announcement, released May 21st, describes it as Naval Incident A. He died during combat operations at the front. The Americans, for their part, report that a civilian observer happened to see him boarding a plane. The codebreakers must be protected. Even the story of his death is immediately shaped into something other than what it was. His ashes returned to Japan aboard the battleship Musashi, one of the two enormous battleships he had fought against building, the ones he had called elaborate religious scrolls, matters of faith rather than reality. He lost that argument in 1941. He came home on one in 1943. For decades after his death, the most famous thing Yamamoto ever said was a line about awakening a sleeping giant, filling it with a terrible resolve. It appeared in a 1970 American film attributed to him in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor. The director later acknowledged Yamamoto may never have said it. No document has ever been produced, not in Japanese archives, not in American ones. The most famous thing he supposedly said was written in Hollywood, 25 years after he was gone. But the idea that he understood precisely what Pearl Harbor had awakened, that he had seen it coming and said so, is not invented. It is documented across a decade of letters, speeches, and conversations, verified and attested. He did not need a film to tell his story. He had told it himself, plainly, repeatedly, to anyone who would listen. 1 month after Pearl Harbor, on January 9, 1942, he wrote to the journalist Ogata Takatora. He wrote, "I felt from the start that America was not likely to relinquish lightly positions established at the cost of such sacrifices. But everybody here always persists in facile optimism until the very worst actually happens." He was not surprised. He had never been surprised. He had simply been unable to stop it. The jungle on Bougainville grows over its scars. The seat is gone. The sword is in a museum, the wreckage cleared decades ago. What persists is the shape of it, a man who saw clearly, who said what he saw, who was overruled, and who then executed with lethal precision the very catastrophe he had spent years trying to prevent. He confirmed his own prediction. He made the proof himself. He held his sword to the end. The strategy was ruins.